Greetings. My name is John Black. I was born in England in Northumberland County, which is very much in the north part of England, right on the border of Scotland, actually. My mother and father, William and Cecily Black, were also born there in 1790s, and I was born in 1821. I lived there with my family, including my 3 brothers and my 3 sisters. And the area where I was raised had a history of thousands of years of civilization dating back to Roman times, and actually contained a remnant of Hadrian's Wall near where I lived. My father was a farmer in a rich agricultural area, and I started helping him with the farm until 1838, when at 16 years old, my family all traveled to America aboard a ship called the Superior. We went to Newcastle on Tyne, boarded the ship, and we landed in New York City after 67 days at sea. My father and mother were heading for the rich farmlands of Ohio, and we settled in Knox County. I joined the district school there as a teenager in Knox County, and soon after I began the study of medicine at Frederickstown Academy when I was 22. And I continued to study medicine. I went to the Cleveland Medical College, where I attended many lectures, and I graduated with honors there in 1847. I soon opened a medical office in the city of Clarendon, Ohio, and I practiced medicine there for several years. While I lived there, I met a young lady named Miss Martha Wiley, whose father was a farmer like my father. Her upbringing was much different than mine, though. Having been born in a log cabin that her father had built, they grew up surrounded by the wilderness, bears, deer, and wolves. She did not have a kitchen, but cooked in a fireplace. Her mother taught her skills of spinning and sewing, cooking and keeping house, and we were married in 1848, and we lived in Clarendon, Ohio until 1854. 2 years before that, my father, William Black, gathered the rest of the family and traveled along with several other families to Missouri. They had loaded enough household goods that they could stop along the way to camp and cook each night until they arrived. It took them 6 weeks of travel to Missouri, and they landed in DeKalb County, Missouri, where he bought a tract of land about a half a mile from the village of Maysville. He cleared the land and established an excellent farm there, and he lived with the family there until his death. He is also buried in the Maysville Cemetery. He's buried right over there, William Black. In 1854, about 2 years after my father moved to Maysville, I moved with my family to the frontier land of Missouri. At this time, my family consisted of my wife and I and our 4 children, Erasmus, Junius, Josephine, and Deborah. We traveled from Ohio via rail to Rock Island, Illinois, which was about as far as the railroad went at that time. And we took the stagecoach to Mount Pleasant, Iowa. There we hired a hack, which is what we call a vehicle for hire in England. And that vehicle took us to Centerville, Iowa. From that point on, we drove a 2-horse wagon the rest of the way to Maysville. And once we arrived, I began to practice medicine here in Maysville. In 1800, most doctors traveled by foot or horseback to patients' homes, and in this practice, a physician was limited to the number of tools he could carry in a little bag or saddlebags. So I also knew that I needed a fine home from which to establish my practice. I built a brick structure on the corner of Main Street and Water Street, and it is this house that has caused my name to be remembered in Maysville, as it is still standing after 170 years. My family lived here during my entire time in Maysville. My youngest son, Robert, was born here in 1855. And in the year 1862, my father, William Black, passed away at his farm in Maysville. And my mother went to live at the home of my brother, Alexander. She passed away in 1873, and she's also buried here in the Maysville Cemetery next to Father. When my father died, I decided to move away from Maysville to the city of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. And the house I built in Maysville stood empty for a while, and much of my medical equipment was stored in the basement. At this time, the American Civil War was well underway, and most of Maysville at this time, myself included, was strongly aligned with the Democratic Party. We had elected Democratic presidents and leaders in this county for the previous 20 years. Because of this, there were those living in Maysville who were sympathetic to the Confederate cause and who had family members who had joined the Southern Army. Mothers and other friends who wanted to provide socks and supplies for their soldiers began to use the house as a place to temporarily store these supplies for the Southern Army until a delivery method could be obtained. And so word reached my wife and I in Nebraska that Union soldiers came and broke in and upset my cabinets and destroyed all my medicine and powders in the basement. They also found molasses had been poured all over the basement floor. Soldiers must have repeatedly checked the house for supplies, but occasionally some of the ladies would meet there, probably to complete the arrangements to send clothing and stuff and things to their soldiers. Occasionally, they would send clothing, food, and letters to their menfolk in the Confederate Army, but guns and ammunition were never included. Always items of joy, but never items of destruction. Items of importance were also sent. A story was later shared that a young girl from the Hewitt family was sent into the house to deliver a package of socks for the supplies, and while she was there, she was surprised by the sight of Northern soldiers looking in the window. She hid from them, and fortunately, they didn't enter the house that night. At times, the Union soldiers then stationed at Cameron, Missouri, would call this house to investigate, but not a single occasion did they find any items to be confiscated. The house served its purpose well. I spent the rest of my life in my new town of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. It was also a small town, but began to boom and was soon a large city. I opened up a medical practice there and soon also became identified with financial interests of the city and county. I was active in obtaining the establishment of the Bank of Cass County, where I was president, and eventually sold out my share of stock. I then assisted in founding the Citizens Bank and was president of the bank for 3 years. I also assisted in starting the commercial bank at Weeping Water, and another enterprise was the construction of a large city block that I was able to construct, known as Union Block. And after a while, having obtained an ample income, I retired from medical practice and lived on my investments. I enjoyed a prominent position in society, a large circle of friends, and entertained them often in our fine home. My wife Martha was admired and esteemed for her many amiable qualities. She was a devoted member of the Presbyterian Church, lending her influence to promoting its many good works. And it would be wonderful to end my story here with this fairy tale ending, but it was not to be. I don't know if it was due to corrupting influence of wealth or due to the physical deterioration of my body and mind, but my family began to notice problems, and within a year or two of this time, things began to unravel. In 1890, my wife and Martha and I decided to separate. Shortly afterwards, I remarried a younger lady named Sarah Q, who was 34, and when I was 69 years old. My wife and children and their families who lived in Plattsmouth, they continued to live there, knowing I was declining and making many questionable decisions. But in 1895, my illnesses caught up with me, and I passed away there in Nebraska. My property was estimated at $80,000, which in today's money would be $2.9 million. It was divided among my family, and a sale bill published in the paper a few years later described my lavish home for sale, stating it could be purchased for a very cheap price. The same year as the property settled, in 1900, Martha passed away, but she was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Plattsmouth. I did have the forethought to request that my remains be brought here to Maysville, to be buried near my parents, and that the service be attended by those who remembered me fondly. My sister Isabella, who is buried over here, and my brother Alexander, who's buried right back here, they had become beloved members of the community. Alexander had been the postmaster and county clerk in Maysville, and in my obituary, I was described as the brother of Grandma Iden, which is what my sister was known as. And so a newspaper report of my funeral states that after being returned to Maysville, my body remained for one more night at the house where I had lived, and then was removed to the church and then the cemetery, surrounded by friends. My home is still standing and is located a few blocks from this cemetery on the corner of Main and Water Street. With it still standing, I guess I am continuing to be a part of the Maysville community.